First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank especially and commend the sponsors for making this event happen. In particular, I want to thank Binder for their help organizing the event. They were especially kind to me in the process of organizing. And on behalf of the Human Rights Foundation, first of all, the president, Thor Halverson, and the chairman, Gary Kasparov, I want to say that it's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today and to be given the opportunity to comment on all of the things that we've heard today, from experts to refugees, speaking on the challenges of obtaining health, education, housing, and employment in the U.S. as refugees. And I want to talk to you to frame that conversation a little bit about HRF, the Human Rights Foundation. One of the unique features of the organization as far as mission statement is that we focus exclusively on closed societies, on authoritarian regimes, whether fully authoritarian, your classic dictatorship, or competitive authoritarian regimes that are not as close as a dictatorship but that do not qualify as a democracy. For example, Nigeria, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, Venezuela. So authoritarian regimes are our main focus as human rights group. And all of the members of our conscience, and most of them fled their countries, escaped as refugees or asylum seekers, and now live in democratic and free and democratic societies. So the focus of our work goes from North Korea to Equatorial Guinea to Cuba to Iran, places where scores of people, thousands of people have throughout the years, through decades, escaped hardship. And the reason we focus on closed societies and authoritarian regimes, the logic behind it is that while democracies are imperfect, and there is no question about that, while democracies are imperfect, they allow for people to associate in civil society groups that will eventually counter the rhetoric, maybe anti-refugee of the government sometimes, or a certain politician or a certain political faction will be able to counter that through associating in groups like the ones that have organized this event today, like the Refugee Dream Center, or the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees sponsored Refugee Congress, who's also a co-organizer today. So democracies allow for this type of groups to operate freely, to put together this kind of events. This is unthinkable in a country like North Korea or like Equatorial Guinea or like Sudan, Darfur, where you will sit here and blame whoever that it is to blame for the problems that cause refugees to exist in the first place, right? So because of that is that we focus on authoritarian regimes. We do feel that our help is much less needed in democratic countries where, again, there are thousands of associations, groups, from, again, NGOs like the ones I mentioned, to political parties, to independent media, small journalism. Now with social media, most democracies allow for full internet, so all citizens are able to express their opinions through their blogs, their Facebooks, etc. And at the same time, authoritarian regimes, they crack down on people, not only traditional media, as you see in Kazakhstan, where all the big newspapers and TV channels were shut down around 3 years ago, but nowadays they're also imprisoning people for their Facebook posts. And that's true as well for countries like Uganda, and even, again, competitive authoritarian regimes like Angola, who is currently about to pass, hopefully won't, it's in the Senate in the third reading, a social media law that bans messages on WhatsApp and Facebook that are critical of the government. And this criticism goes in all areas that you can think of, from, again, health, education, employment, for the society as a whole, and of course on these issues when it comes to minorities, and specific the refugee minority that exists in all countries. So democracies, again, you see that democracies are discussing this not just in the US, but you see it being discussed from Greece in the south of Europe to Germany in the north of Europe, where the ruling parties are in favor of receiving more or less refugees from the Syrian conflict today, to Israel, where the ruling party is against it, but where the opposition that is allowed to exist and that is allowed to operate and criticize government policies, and hopefully at some point will be allowed to, will be able to be the government and be more friendly to refugees. These things happen only in democracies. To Latin America, a continent that 30 years ago was riddled with dictatorial regimes, from Argentina's Videla's Argentina to Pinochet's Chile, anti-communist dictatorships, and that today, as you see, is receiving refugees in a lot of these countries. Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile are examples of countries that today, not just the US, not just in Germany, are receiving refugees, but also so-called developing countries. As long as they're democracies, they are going to tend to receive refugees. Not because the governments are very nice and they're gracious and they want to, this some politician that likes this necessarily, but because people inside those countries have a voice. And Argentina, Brazil are countries that have years ago, decades ago, received thousands of Syrians or Lebanese. I'm from Bolivia, my background is Lebanese. People that were fleeing wars in their countries years ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, and that now are part of these populations. So because of the democratic systems, they're allowed to associate and to be friendly with refugees and to put together this type of events and to honestly discuss the ways to solve issues like, again, health, education, employment, and housing. And you'll say, maybe, why is it my singing praises to democracy here? That's all I've been doing since I got to this stage. It might sound strange for a lot of the people that are in this auditorium right now, but I can tell you for sure that for refugees, that is not a truism, that is not something that they take for granted. It's no coincidence that Omar started his speech by being thankful of being in a democratic country, of having found the hospitality of democracy in a country, because he fled the Gambian regime, the Gambia that was ruled by a dictatorship, as well as Isabel, who fled Angola's civil war, who was won by the current ruling dictator, the Dos Santos kleptocratic regime that has been ruling that country for decades, whose children are owners of the main companies that do business with the West, and that yet don't allow for opportunities for the peoples there, and that cruelly kick them out, have them escape as refugees, as asylum seekers, because they do not tolerate criticism, they do not tolerate diversity, they do not tolerate different ideas. And this is true also in history. Non-democratic governments or authoritarian regimes have been usually the root cause in each of the big humanitarian crises, including the world's biggest famines, especially in the 20th century. From Stalin's totalitarian rule that led to millions of people, Ukrainian dying in the 20th century, to, again, Mao's great leap forward, to Pol Pot's crackdown on their people that led to the annihilation of almost 25% of Cambodia's population in the second part of the 20th century. These are all man-made humanitarian crises that led to, again, millions of people dead, millions of people, and those are the ones that couldn't flee. The ones that fled are refugees all around the world, including in the United States. We heard the story of someone from Vietnam who was very closely linked to the conflict in Cambodia. And to today's Kim dynasty, this is not just a thing from the Cold War, from the early 60s, but North Korea, just in the 90s, hundreds of thousands of people. I think the number is around 200,000 people are estimated to to have died of famine, of starvation in North Korea due to the policies of the totalitarian regime that rules the northern part of the Korean peninsula. And again, wars are also not just the man-made humanitarian crisis due to atrocious economic policy, but also due to wars that are entered into primarily at the beginning, at the core of it, due to authoritarian regimes that do not allow for democracy inside their countries. And this is the case of Syria that we see today, and this was nicely put in President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize lecture in 2009, where he said America has never fought a war against a democracy, which is true, and our closest friends are governments that protect the rights of the citizens. That does not mean, again, that America does not wine and dine also with dictators, from the Saudi Arabian kings or the Bahrain king to Raúl Castro just recently in Cuba. But it's not part of a conspiracy that they actually like these dictators, but it's part of the idea that we live in a post-Westphalian world, that they're members of the United Nations. You have to have some sort of diplomacy with them, but first and foremost, and clearly the friends of democracies tend to be democracies, and America is a democracy that has never gone to war with other democracies. So the thousands and thousands of refugees that have fled their countries, including some of the ones that I spoke today, well, they value the opportunities in terms of, again, housing, employment, education, and health that they will get in free societies. One of the thing at the core that they will care for tends to be just democracy and freedom, because these are the vehicles that then will allow, for the number of NGOs that have spoken here today as well, that in partnerships with government institutions provide for all of these services, housing again, health, education, employment. These are things that are possible only in a regime that allows for people to actually be able to that. So I wanted to underline that point. And to close, even if Isabel properly discovered that the United States, well, she said Providence, has rats, that's not just the case of Providence or Rhode Island, it's also the case of New York. I don't know if you saw this nice clip by the Colbert Report on Pizza Rat in New York. I remember the commencement speech by the dean of the law school at Columbia. He used to mention that in the 70s they would have in the auditorium, all the class, all the law school, rats running around in the back. So there are rats in America. There are rats in most democracies around the world. Democracies that were colonized, years ago by the people from the global north, Nordic peoples, Anglo-Saxons, etc., tend to not say hi in the elevator. That's true. They are not as warm as people in the global south when it comes to those cultural little things. I felt it as well coming from Bolivia. When I first moved to the U.S., people don't say hi in the elevator. So, well, these are, in fact, things that you face in a free society. First and foremost, one is thankful, and definitely all refugees that we've come across through our work, the members of the International Council, are particularly thankful whenever they're able to leave an authoritarian country, a crisis, a humanitarian crisis caused by a dictator, for a country that will allow for opportunities, and not just, again, health, education, employment, and work and housing, but the basic freedom and democracy that allows for these things to be discussed honestly and to this service to be provided eventually the right way. So I want to end my presentation by asking for a round of applause to all of the refugees that we have here today, and to the expert and policy people that selflessly devote their lives, partially or totally, to help the refugees. Thank you.